fish now. And we said, she's a fish? What do you mean? What happened? And he said, well, some bad guys hurt her. Mm-hmm. And that really made me stop, because I only recently heard the whole facts of this story about my father's sister. And she indeed was murdered, and she was thrown into San Francisco Bay.
A family secret. Little Gus could never have heard about this story, because even Ron Ortega did not know about his father's sister. How could his son?
I really hadn't thought of reincarnation, or even putting that word in connection with what was happening. I wasn't brought up, with learning about reincarnation. I was brought up Southern Baptist, and certainly did not hear about reincarnation.
If you had told me that a year ago, yeah, right. You've come back. Uh-huh. But, now, anything can happen. Yeah, anything.
In his hotel room, Jim Tucker reviews his notes. There are many questions, especially when it comes to same family cases, like the Ortegas.
Whenever we investigate a case, we certainly have to assess the reliability of the informants. With this same family case, we always have the concern that the family members are grieving for the lost family member, and therefore have the wish that the child would be returned.
Despite the possible weaknesses with cases like the Ortegas, there are still many questions that nobody seems to have convincing answers to.
Whether you accept the idea that this necessarily means reincarnation, which means a soul that moves from one body to the next, that's for each person to decide.
Professor Haraldsson and his translator climb the steep steps to one of Sri Lanka's most recognizable landmarks, the famous rock temple of Dambulla.
The next step in the investigation of this case leads us here to the Dambulla temple, because Diluxi had spoken about it. And then the family, they decided to do something about Diluxi's talk. Diluxi's parents decided to call the abbot living in this temple and ask him if he knew of any girl who had died in this area and who fit the description given by Diluxi. In most of the countries where we find these cases, there is a belief in reincarnation.
If a culture principally allows for the concept of rebirth, does that make reports of previous lives more likely? May that be one of the reasons why the best cases can be found in places like Sri Lanka?
Here in Sri Lanka, we find most of the cases among Buddhist families. Of course, the majority of the population here is Buddhist, about 2/3. But we also find some cases among Christians, and we even find a few among the Muslims. So the cases in Sri Lanka are found in all the major religious communities.
The key to solving Diluxi's case may very well lie with the abbot of the rock temple. Haraldsson and his translator can count on the fact that here, their investigation will be taken seriously, because reincarnation is a common concept for a Buddhist monk.
Buddhism teaches us that reincarnation exists. It happens due to the accumulation of good and bad deeds, which we call karma. Our desire to live in this world pulls us into our next birth, and the number of good and bad deeds we have performed determine the circumstances of our next birth.
But in the case of Delukshi, the abbot is unable to help. He knows of no other family that matches Delukshi's memories. Instead, he refers the scientist to the local newspaper. A personal friend of the abbot's, a journalist, decided to investigate Delukshi's claims after speaking with the monk.
This is how the story continued. Mr. Apipala, he learned about the case. He went and interviewed Delukshi and the parents about what she had been saying about the previous life. It was then published a few days later. And this newspaper has a distribution all over the country.
For the journalist, it was a good story.
I consider this case unique because for over 30 years I've researched these types of stories and have come across various people who talked about their previous births. But this one is 1 in 1,000.
His readers were enthralled with Delukshi's mysterious memories and the remarkable details she remembered. But for now, one question remains unanswered. Will the scientists find a match to Delukshi's memories of an earlier life and death? A newspaper journalist had written an article about Delukshi's memories of a past life. The article mentioned that the girl thinks she used to live near the Dambula rock temple. Several weeks after the article was published, the mail arrives at the Nisanka home. When the postman handed Mr. Nisanka his mail that day, he was surprised to find one letter postmarked from Dambula. He had no friends or relatives in that part of the country. When he opened the letter, he was stunned.
I was very surprised to receive a letter by a Mr. Ranatunga. He lives in Dambula. I was stunned when I read that his little daughter had died just the way Delukshi had always talked about. He talked about the river and the footbridge. His little girl was called Shiromi.
Shiromi's father confirmed many of Delukshi's statements, and he said he would like to meet her.
I missed my previous parents very much, and I longed to see them again. After this letter, my second mother was finally convinced, and she agreed we would go and meet with them.
There was nothing her current parents could do. Delukshi was now determined to meet the people who she believed were her true family. If they would not take her to them, she threatened to run away. The letter finally convinced Delukshi's parents. They were going to take her to the place where she thinks she died. They took Delukshi on a 6-hour drive to Dambula. When they came closer to the city, Delukshi began to recognize landmarks. She even started to direct the driver toward the house where her previous family lived.